My husband of 54 years, the man I had built a life and an empire with, stood at the head of our dining room table, surrounded by our children and grandchildren, raised a glass of his finest champagne, and, in his toast to our life together, called me useless. He had no idea that that one single, carelessly cruel word would cost him everything. Hi everyone, I'm Grandma Katherine. My name is Catherine Sterling. I am 80 years old, and for the past 2 years my home has been here, in a quiet little apartment in Boston. Though, for my entire life before that, my home was a rambling, beautiful old house in the Connecticut countryside. A house that I helped build, a house that I loved, and a house that I loved, and a house that I loved, and a house that I, in the end, was forced to leave. This story, my goodness, this is a story I have kept locked away in the most private vault of my heart. It is the story of a 54-year marriage, and of the single moment that brought it all crashing down. My own children, my dear, beloved children, know that their father and I are no longer together. They know there was a bitter, terrible fight over the family business. They think their mother, in her grief and her old age, simply had a breakdown. They do not know that it was not a breakdown. It was an awakening. They do not know that their father's one, careless, public act of contempt was the final spark that ignited a fire that had been smoldering for 50 years. And they do not know that I, their quiet, supportive, useless mother, was the one who, in the end, quietly, legally, and with the most profound and satisfying finality, took his entire company away from him. There is a particular kind of pain, you see, that comes from a long and quiet erasure. It is the pain of being the silent partner, the unseen architect, the unacknowledged engine of a shared life. You tell yourself it doesn't matter. You tell yourself that his success is your success. You tell yourself that a supportive role is a noble one, and you believe it. Until one day you look around and you realize that the story of your life, the one everyone is telling, is a story in which you are merely a footnote. The shame of it. It is the shame of having allowed yourself to become invisible. I am telling this story now because I am done with being invisible. I am telling it because I have learned that a woman's worth is not determined by the credit she is given, but by the quiet, steady, and often unseen work of her own 2 hands. And I am telling it for any woman or any man who has ever felt like the silent, unacknowledged partner in their own life. Before I begin this difficult, and I must confess, rather triumphant story, I would be so very grateful for your support. Please, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your presence here, your willingness to listen to an old woman's long and complicated tale, it is a great comfort. It gives me the strength to finally open the boardroom door of my memory and reveal the true, and until now, secret accounting of my life. Thank you, my dears. Thank you for that. My story, our story, began in 1968, not in a grand Charleston drawing room, but in a cramped, drafty apartment over a hardware store. I was a bookkeeper, with a sharp mind for numbers and a quiet, steady nature. He, my Richard, was a brilliant, ambitious young builder, a man with a poet's soul and a craftsman's hands. He didn't have a penny to his name, but he had a vision. He saw the beautiful, old, neglected houses of our Connecticut town, and he didn't see decay. He saw potential. He was a man who could see the beauty in things that others had discarded. Our life, in those early years, was a whirlwind of hard work and shared dreams. Our dates were not to fancy restaurants. They were to dusty, abandoned farmhouses that he wanted to resurrect. Our love was built on a foundation of sawdust and paint fumes and the quiet, shared satisfaction of a hard day's work. We were a team, a true and equal team. He was the visionary, the artist. He could see the hidden beauty in a crumbling foundation, the elegant lines beneath a century of neglect. And I was the pragmatist, the engine, the one who made his beautiful dreams a reality. I remember one night, in those very first years, when we were on the verge of losing everything. We had poured all of our money, and the bank's money, into the restoration of our first big project, the old hemlock mill. A payroll was due, our suppliers were demanding payment, and we were $2,000 short. I will never forget the look on his face. He was a proud man, and he was defeated. "It's over, Kath," he'd whispered, his head in his hands. I was a fool. I aimed too high. I didn't say a word. I just poured him a cup of coffee and I went to work. I sat at that kitchen table all night, with my ledger books, my invoices, and my quiet, steady determination. I called our suppliers at dawn. I renegotiated our payment terms. I moved money from one account to another. I found a flaw in our tax accounting that would result in a small but immediate refund. I found the $2,000. When he woke up, I slid a piece of paper across the table to him. It was a balanced budget. He had looked at me, his eyes full of a relief and a gratitude so profound it was almost worship. He took my hands that were smudged with ink from the ledger, and he held them to his lips. "You are my secret weapon, Katherine Sterling," he'd whispered. "The whole world sees the houses I build, but you are the foundation that no one sees. And without you, it would all turn to dust." In that moment, I had never felt so seen, so loved, so essential. We built our company, Sterling Homes, on that foundation. He was the face of it, the charismatic, brilliant visionary who charmed the clients and the banks. I was the silent partner, the one who managed the books, who negotiated with the suppliers, who hired the subcontractors, the one who made sure the beautiful, rickety, and often chaotic engine of his creative genius actually ran. And it did run. Our business boomed. We bought our beautiful old house in the countryside. We had our children, our dear Michael, and our sweet Anne. We built a beautiful, successful, and deeply happy life. And for 20 years, I was his secret weapon, his partner, his equal. The change, when it came, was not a sudden, violent storm. It was a slow, almost imperceptible shift in the climate. It was a cooling. It began when the business grew from a small, local company into a regional powerhouse. He started spending more time in the city, at meetings with bankers and investors. He started wearing expensive, tailored suits that I had not picked out. He started coming home with stories of a world I was not a part of, a world of expensive lunches and backroom deals, a world where my quiet, methodical competence was not as valuable as his easy, backslapping charm. He never stopped loving me, but he stopped seeing me. I was no longer his partner in the adventure. I was the quiet, competent, and utterly reliable woman who managed the home front, who raised the children, who kept the books balanced so that he could go out into the world and be the brilliant, conquering hero of his own story. The first time he called me useless, it was not with malice. It was with a kind of fond, dismissive affection. It was a joke. He was telling the children about a difficult negotiation with the zoning board. I had been the one who had spent a week in the town archives, digging up the old zoning laws that had won us the case. I tried to add a detail to his story. "The key, you see," I started to say, "was the 1923 easement." And he had cut me off with a wave of his hand and a big, booming laugh. "Oh, my darling," he'd said, smiling at the children. "Your mother is a genius with a recipe book, but she is utterly, completely, and wonderfully useless when it comes to the complexities of business law." He had said it with a smile, with love. Our children had laughed, and I had felt a sharp, cold, and terrible sting. It was a joke, but it was a joke that held a terrible, ugly truth. In the story he was now telling about our life, the story of his heroic, solitary success, my role, my contribution, my mind. It was being slowly, lovingly, and with a charming smile, rendered completely and utterly useless. It was the first cut in a death by 1,000 cuts that would take 30 more years to finally bleed me dry. The 30 years that followed were, on the surface, a beautiful life. Sterling Homes became a brand, a symbol of quality and taste throughout New England. Richard became a local celebrity, the charismatic, self-made man who had resurrected our town's most beautiful historic homes. He was on the boards of charities, he was in the society pages, he was the man everyone wanted to know. And I I was the perfect, supportive, and increasingly silent wife. The joke, the one about me being wonderfully useless when it came to business, became a staple of his public narrative. It was his favorite story. He would tell it at dinner parties, at award ceremonies, at family gatherings. It was always told with a great, booming laugh and a warm, affectionate arm around my shoulders. It was a performance of love, a public declaration of his affection for his charming, domestic, and utterly non-threatening wife. I could not have done any of this without my better half, he would say, his eyes twinkling as he looked at me. My Catherine, she is the heart of our home. She is a brilliant hostess, a wonderful mother, a genius in the garden. But if you ask her to read a balance sheet, she is wonderfully, beautifully useless. The crowd would always laugh, a warm, appreciative laugh. They saw a great man lovingly teasing his dear, sweet wife. They did not see the truth. They did not see that with every telling of that joke, he was chipping away at my history, at my contribution. He was erasing the woman who had sat at the kitchen table all night, balancing the books that had saved his company. He was erasing the partner and replacing her with a prop. And I played my part. What was I to do? To object would have been to make a scene, to be seen as a shrew, a woman without a sense of humor. So I would smile. I would laugh along with the crowd. And with every forced laugh, a small, quiet, and essential part of my own soul would just die. My inner life became a quiet, lonely place. I poured myself into my children, into my garden, into my home. I was the silent, unpaid, and unacknowledged chief operating officer of our entire domestic world. I managed the staff. I managed the finances of the house. I managed the social calendar. I created the perfect, seamless, and beautiful world that allowed him to go out and be the brilliant, conquering hero of his own story. Our children, Michael and Anne, grew up in the shadow of their father's larger-than-life personality. They adored him. They saw him as a giant. And they saw me as their loving, supportive, and, yes, slightly old-fashioned mother. The one who baked the cookies and kissed the scraped knees, and who, of course, knew nothing of the complex, important world of business. The narrative Richard had created for the world became the narrative of our family. After the children left for college, and then for their own lives, the house grew quiet. Richard was busier than ever, his empire always expanding. Our conversations, once so rich and full, became thinner. He would tell me of his triumphs and I would listen. He no longer asked for my opinion. He no longer needed a partner. He needed an audience. And I, in my love for him, in my desire to keep the peace, in my deep, bone-weary, and 50-year habit of accommodation, I became the perfect audience. And then, about 10 years ago, our grandchildren began to arrive. And for a while, they were a balm to my quiet, lonely heart. They filled the house with noise and laughter, and a pure, uncomplicated love that asked for nothing but my presence. I was no longer a silent partner or an audience. I was Grandma, and for a while, it was enough. Our son, Michael, married a quiet, gentle woman who was a school teacher. Our daughter, Anne, married a man who was the mirror image of her father. His name was Robert, and he was a brilliant, ambitious, and devastatingly charming young investment banker. Robert saw my husband not just as a father-in-law, but as a mentor, a role model. He would sit with Richard for hours in the study, a glass of whiskey in his hand, listening to his stories, absorbing his lessons. Richard, in his old age, was delighted. He saw in Robert the same fire, the same hunger, that he had possessed as a young man. He saw himself. I, however, saw something different. I saw a young man who had the same ambition as my husband, but none of his foundational integrity. I saw a man who was a student of Richard's success, but not of his hard work. And Robert, he adopted Richard's narrative about me completely. He treated me with a kind of perfect, chivalrous, and utterly dismissive courtesy. He saw me as a charming, elegant, and completely irrelevant old woman. A useless piece of the family's beautiful, decorative furniture. He would ask my opinion on the wine, on the flowers, on the art. But if I ever dared to venture a comment on the stock market or on a business news story, he would smile that same, patient, indulgent smile my husband had perfected over the years. "Oh, Katherine," he would say with a soft chuckle, turning to my daughter. "Your mother is a national treasure. We must protect her from the ugly, boring world of finance. And Anne, my dear, sweet Anne, who so adored her brilliant husband and her larger-than-life father, would just laugh." She had been hearing that joke her whole life. She believed it. The ground was being prepared. The family narrative, the one that had been 30 years in the making, was now being passed to a new generation. The story was set in stone. Richard was the brilliant, visionary builder, and Katherine was his beautiful, supportive, and wonderfully useless wife. I did not realize that this narrative, this quiet, 50-year-long campaign of erasure, was about to reach its final, brutal, and very public climax. I did not realize that my husband, in the final act of our long life together, was about to deliver the one, single, unforgivable cut that would finally, after all these years, make me bleed. The breaking point, the moment the quiet, cold war of my life became a hot, silent, and world-shattering cataclysm, came on the day of our 54th wedding anniversary. Richard, my Richard, decided to throw the party to end all parties. It was a celebration of his life, of his success, of the empire he had built. It was, he declared to all our friends, a tribute to me, his silent, steadfast partner. I knew, of course, that it was not a tribute to me. It was a tribute to his own story of himself, a story in which I was the beautiful, silent, and decorative co-star. But I played my part, as I always had. I wore the pearls he had bought me. I smiled. I greeted our guests. I was the perfect, gracious, and supportive wife. Our children and our grandchildren were all there. Michael and his sweet wife, Anne, and her brilliant predatory husband, Robert Doughty. They were all a part of the beautiful, perfect picture. A picture of a dynastic American family, celebrating a lifetime of success. The afternoon was a blur of champagne, and polite laughter, and 1,000 meaningless conversations. But I was not really there. I was a ghost at my own feast, floating through the rooms, my mind a quiet, lonely, and deeply weary place. I had been playing this part for so long, I had almost forgotten who the real Katherine was. And then, it came time for the toast. He stood at the head of the terrace, the king in his castle, surrounded by his adoring subjects. He raised his glass, and a hush fell over the crowd. "My friends," he began, his voice a deep, confident, and charming rumble. "Thank you all for being here today, to celebrate 54 years with this incredible woman." He turned and smiled at me, and it was a smile of genuine, if deeply proprietorial, affection. 54 years, it is a lifetime. He spoke beautifully about our life together. He told the old, familiar stories. The story of our first, drafty apartment. The story of our first, daring business venture. But the story he told was not our story. It was his story. It was a story of his vision, his courage, his genius. The word "e" was the hero of every sentence. The word "we" was a footnote. "I built this company from nothing," he said. "I took the risks. I made the hard decisions." I stood beside him, smiling my serene, supportive smile, and I felt a familiar 50-year-old ache in my heart. The ache of the invisible foundation. The ache of the silent, unacknowledged partner. And then, he came to the end of his speech. He raised his glass higher. He looked at me, his eyes twinkling with that familiar, charming, and utterly dismissive light. "And I could not have done any of it," he boomed, his voice full of a grand, magnanimous warmth, "without my secret weapon. The woman who has managed my home, who has raised my children, who has hosted my parties with a grace and a style that is second to none. The woman who, thank God, knows absolutely nothing about business." A ripple of warm, knowing laughter went through the crowd. My children, my grandchildren, my son-in-law, Robert. They were all smiling, waiting for the familiar, beloved punchline. I said it before, and I will say it again, he continued, his smile widening as he looked directly at me, a look of pure, fond, and utterly devastating condescension. When it comes to the complex, difficult, and important world of finance, of business, of the very empire that has given us this beautiful life, my dear, beloved Catherine is wonderfully, beautifully, and completely useless. And in that moment, in that bright, sun-drenched, and laughter-filled moment, surrounded by my entire family, something inside me that had been slowly, quietly, and painfully dying for 50 years, finally and with a terrible, silent, and irrevocable finality, broke. It was not the word itself. I'd heard that word 1,000 times. It was the audience. It was the occasion. It was the final, public, and celebratory coronation of a story in which I simply did not exist. He was not just telling a joke. He was delivering a eulogy. The eulogy for the woman I had once been. The partner. The foundation. I looked at my children, my beautiful, loving children, and I saw that they believed the story completely. They were laughing at a joke that was, in fact, the central, defining tragedy of my entire life. And they had no idea. I looked at my husband, the man I had loved, the man I had built a world with, and I did not see the charming, brilliant boy I had married. I saw a stranger, a cruel, arrogant, and deeply lonely old man, a king who had become so consumed by his own myth that he could no longer see the woman standing right beside him. And in that moment, the love I had for him, a love that had been the sun in my sky for 54 years, simply went out. It was not a dramatic, fiery death. It was a quiet, cold, and absolute extinguishment. The party continued. I smiled. I mingled. I was the perfect hostess to the very end. But I was a ghost. A polite, smiling, and beautifully dressed ghost, haunting the ruins of my own life. That night, after the last guest had departed, after the house was finally, mercifully, quiet, I went not to our bedroom, but to the small, quiet guest room at the end of the hall. And I locked the door. I did not sleep. I sat in a chair by the window, and I watched the moon travel across the sky. And I made a decision. A quiet, cold, and perfectly logical decision. The war was not a war of emotion. It was a war of ownership. And my husband, my brilliant, visionary husband, had made one single and catastrophic mistake. He had believed his own story. He believed he was the sole architect of his empire. He had forgotten. He had forgotten that 50 years ago, in a dusty, drafty apartment, it was his quiet, supportive, and useless wife who had been the one to co-sign the original business loan. He had forgotten that it was my name, my credit, my small but crucial inheritance that had been the true foundation of his first great venture. And he had forgotten that my name, Catherine Sterling, was not just on the invitations to his parties. It was on every deed, every stock certificate, every single, solitary, and legally binding document of ownership for the entire Sterling Homes empire. He thought he was the king. He had no idea that I, his silent, invisible partner, was the one who legally, quietly, and completely owned the throne. The game was over. He had delivered his final, killing blow. And now, it was my move. The morning after my own public execution was the first morning of my new life. The 54 years of quiet, wifely accommodation had been burned away in the fire of my husband's final, casual cruelty. The woman who woke up that morning was not his wife. She was not the mother of his children. She was Catherine Sterling, the 50%, legally documented, and now fully activated co-founder of Sterling Homes. I did not weep. I did not rage. I did not throw a single precious object against the wall, though God knows I wanted to. No, my anger was a cold, quiet, and profoundly focused thing. It was an equation to be solved, an empire to be dismantled, a war to be won. While my husband slept the sound, self-satisfied sleep of a king who believes his reign is absolute, I went to work. My first move was a quiet, early morning drive. I did not drive to the country club. I drove to the city. I went to the old granite building that housed the law offices of Sterling, Abernathy, and Finch, the firm my own father had founded, the firm that held in its dusty, fireproof vaults the entire documented history of my life, my marriage, and my business. I sat with Charles Abernathy, my father's oldest friend and my husband's most trusted advisor, for 3 hours. I did not tell him about the 50 years of quiet erasure. I did not tell him about the joke, about the wound to my heart. I did not speak to him as a woman. I spoke to him as a client. "Charles," I said, my voice as calm and as steady as the old oak desk between us. "I want to see the original partnership agreement, the one Richard and I signed in 1968. I want to see the deed to the house. I want to see the ownership documents for every stock, every bond, every piece of real estate held by this family. I want to see it all. And I want you to explain to me, in the clearest possible terms, what, exactly, is mine." He looked at me, and in his old, wise eyes, I saw not a flicker of surprise. He had been a silent witness to my long, slow erasure for 50 years. He had been waiting for this day. "Katherine," he said, his voice a low, gentle rumble, "everything is yours." The plan we devised that morning was not a plan for a divorce. A divorce was a messy, emotional, and public affair. My plan was for something far cleaner, far quieter, and far more devastating. It was a plan for a corporate restructuring, a quiet, legal, and brutally efficient transfer of power. My husband had made one single, catastrophic mistake. In his 54 years of building his empire, he had never, not once, bothered to legally separate his assets from mine. In his mind, his success was his alone. But on paper, on the 54 years of legal documents filed away in this very office, his success was, and had always been, ours. We were not just husband and wife. We were a legal partnership. And I, the silent, useless partner, was about to exercise my rights. My fight back began with a series of quiet, invisible, and perfectly legal maneuvers. With Mr. Abernathy's guidance, I began to move my pieces across the board. My first move was to create a new, private, and completely independent trust. A trust in my name, and my name alone. The K. Sterling Independence Trust. My second move was the transfer of assets. One by one, over the next few weeks, we began the quiet, legal process of moving 50% of our shared liquid assets, the stocks, the bonds, the cash reserves, into my new private trust. It was a silent, paper-based amputation. He would not even feel it happen until it was too late. My third, and most important, move was the company itself. Sterling Homes. According to the original incorporation documents, we were equal, 50-50 partners. He was the president. I was the secretary-treasurer, a title I had held in name only for 54 years. Title he had always treated as a charming, sentimental joke. He was about to learn that it was not a joke. It was a position of immense, and now, activated, power. As secretary-treasurer, I had the legal right to call a meeting of the board of directors. The board consisted of 3 people, my husband, myself, and our old, trusted friend, Charles Abernathy. I called the meeting. Richard was furious, but he could not refuse. He sat at the head of the long, polished table, a king in his throne room, looking at me with a look of pure, baffled rage. "What is the meaning of this, Katherine?" he boomed. "This is ridiculous. We have nothing to discuss." "On the contrary, Richard," I said, my voice as calm and as polished as the table between us. "We have everything to discuss." I did not raise my voice. I did not make accusations. I simply presented the facts. I presented him with a detailed 54-year accounting of the business. I showed him the original loan documents with my name on them. I showed him the profit and loss statements from the early years, the ones I had balanced myself. I showed him the deeds, the stock certificates, the partnership agreements. I laid out the entire, documented, and legally irrefutable history of our shared success. And then, I presented him with my proposal. The company, I said, is to be divided, as is my legal right as a 50% partner. You will retain the commercial development arm of the business. All of the new, modern, and soulless projects you are so fond of. And I will take the historic restoration division. The heart of the company. The part of it that your father-in-law and I built with our own two hands. Yeah, He just stared at me, his face a mask of pure, uncomprehending shock. You can't be serious, he stammered. I have never been more serious in my life, I said. And then, I played my trump card. Or, I said, letting the word hang in the silent, tense air, we can present this matter to a judge. We can have the courts decide. We can spend the next 5 years of our lives in a very loud, very messy, and very, very public legal battle that will drag our name, our family, and the 54 years of your own carefully crafted myth through the mud. And I let him see the abyss, the public humiliation, the discovery, the one thing a man like my husband, a man who had built his entire life on the foundation of his own heroic narrative, could not possibly bear. He was a proud man. And in that moment, I used his own pride as my weapon against him. He was a king who was being offered a choice. Give up half his kingdom, or watch the whole thing burn to the ground. He knew he was beaten. He knew I had him. The game was over. He did not speak. He just gave a single, sharp, and almost imperceptible nod. The trap was sprung. The war was won. But I was not finished. There was one final piece of business. One final, quiet, and deeply satisfying move to be made. The month that followed our boardroom confrontation was the quietest, coldest, and most civilized war I have ever known. Richard and I were ghosts in our own home, two polite, silent strangers sharing a beautiful 54-year-old tomb. We did not shout. We did not argue. We communicated only through our lawyers. He was a broken man. I had not just taken half of his company, I had taken his story. The beautiful, heroic myth of the self-made man, the story he had spent a lifetime perfecting, had been shattered. He looked at me, and in my quiet, resolute calm, he saw the undeniable, living proof of his own lie. And he could not bear it. He moved into the guest wing of the house. We were like two feudal lords, each ruling our own small, silent territory. The division of our assets, our life's work, proceeded with a brutal legal efficiency. He kept his new, shiny, corporate world, and I kept the heart. I kept the historic restoration division, the part of the business that still held the soul of my father and the hands of my husband. I renamed it. It is no longer Sterling Homes. It is the Sterling and Ainsworth Restoration Company. My father's name is back on the door. But I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I could not stay. This house, it was no longer a sanctuary. It was a battlefield, and it was haunted by the ghost of the woman I had been, the quiet, accommodating wife who had allowed herself to be erased. To truly be free, I had to leave her behind. My final act, the one that was not about business, but about my own soul, was my departure. The day I left, he just stood there, at the top of the stairs, watching me. He did not ask me to stay. He knew he had no right. His pride, the very thing that had caused this great gaping wound between us, would not let him. He just said one thing. "Where will you go?" he asked, his voice a hoarse, broken whisper. I looked up at him, this man I had loved, this man who was now a stranger to me, and I gave him the only truth I had left. "I am going to find a place," I said, "where I am not useless." And I turned, and I walked out the door, and I did not look back. I left the house, the gardens, the life we had built. I left it all. I moved to Boston, to a city where I was not Mrs. Richard Sterling, the supportive, useless wife. I am just Katherine, and it is a wonderful, liberating thing to be. I started a small non-profit foundation, the one I had always dreamed of, one that gives grants to young artisans and craftsmen, the people who, like my father and my husband, build beautiful things with their own two hands. I am, for the first time in a very long time, building something of my own. My children, it has been difficult. The truth of their father's narrative, and of my long silent complicity in it, has been a hard pill for them to swallow. But they are good children, and they are, slowly, beginning to see me, not as a mother, but as a woman. And Richard? He still has his company. He still has his success. He still has his beautiful empty house. He has everything he thought he wanted. But he is a king in a kingdom of one. A lonely old man, haunted by the ghost of the foundation he never saw, and the secret weapon he never knew he had. I learned the hardest lesson of a long life, that a partnership is a delicate, living thing. And if one person is allowed to become the sun, the other will inevitably be forced to live in the shadows. And nothing, not even love, can grow in the shadows. He did not mean to be cruel. He just forgot. He forgot about the girl at the rickety kitchen table. He forgot about the woman who had co-signed the loans. He forgot that his empire was built not on a single pillar, but on two. And his final terrible joke was not a joke about me. It was a joke about himself. He was the one who had been blind. He was the one who had been a fool. So, if you are out there and you feel that you are living in someone else's shadow, that your own light is being dimmed, please remember this old woman. Do not wait 54 years. Do not wait for the one, final, unforgivable cut. Your story is your own. Your life is your own. And you are not, and you have never been, useless. Thank you for letting me share this long and complicated story with you. It is a good reminder, I think, that it is never too late to become the architect of your own life. If you have found strength in this story, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and press that little notification bell so you don't miss what's next. And in the comments below, I would love for you to share a story about a time you rediscovered your own essential value. Love you all. This is Grandma Katherine, and I'll see you in the next story.